Hello, my name is Ryan, and I will be discussing the game theory concepts we learned throughout this semester and apply them to real-world scenarios for my final project. So what is game theory? So game theory is essentially just the study of strategic actions between players, where the outcomes not only depend on our personal actions, but also just like the actions of other people. It helps essentially people better understand decision making in situations where the actions of one person can directly affect the results for others. For example, let's say hypothetically speaking, a student is struggling in a course. They might consider attending a professor's office for assistance if they feel like they need help. And so a student might want assistance, but maybe they don't want to seem too extremely dependable on a professor. But in this scenario, each person's payoff will essentially depend on the behavior of both players, the professor as well as the student. Athletes are also constantly using games of strategy. A defensive football team will react to a play they expect from an offensive football team. And conversely, the offense will choose plays that they think they will choose plays in response to how they think the defense will kind of react and choose their plays. Each side will adjust their strategies to essentially just reduce their disadvantages and maximize their overall payoffs. So to analyze this situation from a student perspective, a student can go to a professor's office but not be prepared. Now this might save a student time in the long run, but by not preparing, this could also lead to less productive help from the professor. And so from a professor's perspective, the student can come across as being less caring, and this incentivizes a professor to offer less or just generalized feedback, which will save their overall time and energy. And so essentially what I'm trying to say is a student investing in themselves equates to a professor investing in them. And this might not always be the case, but this is just analyzing it from a theoretical perspective. Now, I would like to transition to talking more about signaling. This is the topic I struggled with the most throughout the course. So, signaling involves two sides, one being a sender and the other being a receiver. Now the sender will take actions that they want to convey to the receiver, but the receiver remains to have incomplete information. This is known as asymmetric information. Now, asymmetric information can be applied to many scenarios. From the top of my head, I can think of like a car dealer knowing the condition of a car without the person buying the car, obviously. A quarterback knowing an offensive play call that the defense doesn't know, as well as like a product manufacturer knowing like the product quality before the products are even going to be stocked on the shelves. And so now going back to sports, so signaling always occurs in games such as football, and that's kind of what I would like to discuss more in this video. And so, like I mentioned previously, essentially, signaling can be demonstrated a lot through the quarterback's actions. So, in football, for instance, the offense can be in a formation that makes the play call look like a run. So the defense can essentially act accordingly and pick a defensive call that they think will achieve the most beneficial outcome. If the play is truly a run, the defense has a higher probability of maximizing their payoff. However, if the play is actually a pass, the probability of the offense having a higher payoff is much higher in this instance. So Additionally, signaling can get much more complex in football when a quarterback signals for an audible. This means that the offense is set up in a formation for a previously called play, and the quarterback can signal a completely different play when the offense has already been lined up. This kind of makes it very difficult for the defense to respond accordingly. So, looking outside the lens of football and sports as a whole, it's always important in being consistent on making the same decisions. For example, in baseball, if a pitcher is consistently observed to consistently throw a fastball, then the batter will kind of start to expect the fastball. In game theory, performing different moves or making different decisions is what we call having a mixed strategy. And so the goal is to randomize strategies and to be unpredictable to the opposing player. With the use of mixed strategies, we also have what we call equilibriums that can occur. And an equilibrium is a situation where no player can improve their outcomes given that they are changing their strategies. But this is only assuming the strategy of their opponent is consistently saying the same. And so any change could make a player either worse off or provide no benefit. Now, I would like to talk more about types of strategies. So mixed strategies can also tie the idea of indifference amongst players in any given game. And so indifference occurs when a player has no preference with two or more strategies that they have. Because essentially each strategy will yield the same expected payoff. For example, a batter facing a pitcher who is randomizing between fastballs and curveballs can make the batter indifferent in this scenario between swinging at a fastball or the curveball, because the probability of success for both is just essentially going to be the same for each choice. So extending beyond mixed strategies, we also have pure strategies. Now, a pure strategy is a strategy a player sticks with all the time and they don't randomize or mix anything. And so there is no randomness or probability within a pure strategy. It's just sticking with one choice. Players in any given game would like to have dominant strategies. Dominant strategies give players the best expected or probabilistic outcome or result, no matter the strategy the opposing player chooses. And so, in an ideal scenario, this would mean a player does not have to worry about their opposing player, essentially, or their opposing player's move, because the original player's strategy, the one that has the dominant strategy, will always just be dominant to the other. And so now we can talk about dominated strategies. And so these are the ones that players would never want to have. And so a dominated strategy is a strategy that is always worse when being matched up with any other strategy an opposing player will use. And so dominated strategies are never optimal because they will always lead to the worst possible outcome. And so basically rational players in this game would never choose a dominated strategy because they know there's always a better alternative. So the problem with dominated strategies, though, is that there lacks variety. The problem with dominant strategies is that there lacks variety. So once a player gets stuck with always relying on the same strategy, their actions will start to become more predictable to the opposing player. And this will essentially start to become more counteracted in repeat or complex games, because essentially you're using the same strategy over and over and over again. And so this is kind of the reason why players in any given game try to tend to lean toward having more of like a mixed strategy approach. So from a game theoretic perspective, there are two types of games. We have sequential move games, which occur when one player makes a move or a decision, And then second following suit, we have, or sequential move games is when one player makes a move or makes a decision, and then the second player makes a move or makes a decision following suit that. However, this is the opposite of simultaneous move games, where all players in a given game are making their move at the same time, given that there's asymmetric information between all players. So some examples of sequential move games are like things like chess, tic-tac-toe, or other board games, where one player has to make a move first. Most sports games are examples of simultaneous move games because other players are moving or making decisions at the same time, and both teams or both players have asymmetric information at hand. Another type of game one more type of game that can be described are zero-sum games. And so zero-sum games are when one player gains but the opposing player will lose but the same amount. So both gains and losses essentially cancel each other out. And in essence, this is why we call it zero-sum. One example of this would be rock, paper, scissors. So if one player plays rock and the other player plays paper, the player who plays paper will gain one because they won that round, and the one who plays rock will lose one because they lost that round. Now, non-zero-sum games are games that don't need to have balance between losses and gains. So for instance, I'm sitting in a bowling alley right now, and in a game of bowling, if my score sums to be 150 in a 10-frame game, that doesn't take away the potential points another player can score. So the score on the scorecard is independent from each other, and so essentially a player wins by playing well, but their performance doesn't hinder the performance of their opposing player or their opponent they're playing against in any way, shape, or form. So, as a final reflection, I stand firm on believing I deserve a B in this class. Although I struggled on the exam material, I feel like I can confidently explain how the game theory concepts we learn throughout the course relates to the real world. This class helped me grow into a more critical thinker as well as a decision maker, which I really appreciate. So, given my ability to apply game theory to real world scenarios, and just like staying resilient throughout the course, even though my test performance wasn't the greatest, this is a signal that I'm focused on consistent and continuous learning, and by no means do I think that a letter grade is what determines my overall success. And so, additionally, I would like to tie my letter grade into employment. So in a situation where an employer is seeking an employee to have game theoretic thinking, my letter grade is just one piece of the puzzle, and it does not fit the whole picture. My B grade can essentially be a signal to future employers, and employers will form beliefs about their personal confidence in my capabilities and my ability to apply game theoretic concepts in the real world. However, this is an imperfect signal. My true signal is what my private information is, and it is what I contain. And this is something that essentially a letter grade can only partially cover. And so relying on my ability and capability of explaining my game theoretic concepts puts employers in a position of information asymmetry, where the observable signal, such as my grade, does not fully align, or is an observable signal such as my grade, and it may not fully align with my true state of ability. A good example of this would be a marketing course I took this semester. So I finished with an A grade. Now, does this mean that I understood core concepts of marketing? Yes. Does this mean I would be the best person to fill the shoes as a marketing manager for a company? Absolutely not. In fact, let's say a marketing department is looking at hiring a marketing manager. And let's say I'm player one and I made an A in the class as an undergraduate. However, I have no sufficient work experience. And player two, when they were taking game theory, when they were taking marketing, they made a B. But they have 5 years of work experience. Hiring me would be the dominated strategy because I would essentially be guaranteed to not meet the sales objectives, or my probability of meeting the sales objectives would essentially just be super low for the company. Whereas player two would be the dominant player in this scenario because they have the skill set and they would have the higher probability to meet those sales objectives that company would be looking for. So there will be no mixed strategy or randomness to see here.